Sorry, I'm just going to record what I'm doing, so I'm going to go on screen share. So yeah, they're the two programs, the 5x5 and the 5-3-1, and they both use compound exercises with barbells. They obviously both will develop strength very well within those individual exercises and for those techniques. But that, because those exercises have been shown to be the most effective exercises at developing maximum force production, they also will translate over into other exercises you might get someone to do. So it's been shown quite frequently in the literature that if you get someone really strong with these kind of exercises, their performance will translate into other more specific sports-based exercises. If you want to get someone jumping, sprinting, throwing, whatever it might be, someone who's done a program like this, although it's not specific, their physical attributes will then outstrip somebody who's done more specific drills from the beginning, because of the difference in the load and the fact that strength will underpin so many other biomotors, such as explosiveness and power and speed and agility and acceleration, deceleration. So from a strength conditioning point of view, these programs are very, very good foundational programs. What you see is people who are already quite strong using these programs with more specific drills layered on top, which the 5-3-1 has got a bit more space in, built in for it. Let's just go back to the presentation and I can take through. So what I did was I had a look at some of the literature and tried to ascertain whether these were good programs for building strength and what the differences were between them. So I separated it out into two sections. First section looks at these aspects, so rep ranges, set ranges, volumes, training frequency, and rest periods, which often overlap quite a bit, hence why I've looked at them all together. And then section 2 looks a little bit more at exercise selection, the actual periodization style that the programs use, some of the perhaps more psychological side of the programs. Are they easy to stick to, kind of adherence-based stuff? And then also there's apps for both of these programs. And there's some interesting research on the apps in terms of what effect that has on results and adherence. So section 1 is mainly looking at the physical side of it. In terms of the reps and sets, 5x5 is relatively high as a strength program because you've got 5 repetitions, which is up towards the top end of the reps that you'd normally prescribe for developing strength. So reasonably good for beginners, gives people a bit more of an opportunity to learn the movements before lifting very, very heavy. Perhaps a little bit safer if someone's form is not excellent. Psychologically, maybe it's a little bit easier because the weights start a bit lighter, and at least 3 of those reps are going to feel not easy, but certainly not unbelievably difficult. The 5-3-1 is a lower volume, so requires you to be able to lift at a slightly higher intensity. So while both can be used for beginners and intermediates, it's probably better. 5-3-1 is probably arguably slightly better used for advanced lifters, and it's also got a bit more space in the program for the addition of accessory work. So that might also be an added kind of benefit as well. In terms of the overall volume, based on what the literature says, 1 rep on its own, pretty insufficient volume to create strength adaptations. 5 reps, reasonably optimal balance of volume and load for strength. But when you plug those 2 rep ranges into a number of sets, so sequential sets, you then see that 1 set is actually sufficient, but you have to train at such a high intensity to get 1 set to produce any kind of results in terms of increases in strength, that it's really challenging. Well, yeah, just make for a very, very difficult session. 5 sets, I guess what some of the research papers point towards is that you can kind of allow for those relatively lower intensities because you're compensating with a bit more volume. So what's nice is that the ranges that both 5-3-1 and 5-5-5 fit into in terms of volume both seem to be supported by the literature in terms of getting stronger. And it's not necessarily that one is more effective than the other, but actually it seems that intensity is quite important when it comes to getting stronger. Frequency of training. So there's a few interesting papers on this. This particular paper looked at high frequency training, which is 3 times a week, 3 sets per muscle group per session, and a low frequency group where they just trained the agonist once a week, and they did all 9 sets during that one workout. So the total volume was equated to be the same, but the training frequency across the 2 groups was different. And after 8 weeks, what you essentially saw is that the high frequency training group and the low frequency, when they had an equal number of sets, that they got similar improvements. So what we kind of take from that, I think, is that actually, in terms of the frequency, and I mentioned it later on, but it's just frequency of training seems to be just a tool that we can use to, I guess, spread out fatigue across multiple sessions, as opposed to a way of increasing the performance that we might get from somebody. So it also points to the fact that the intensity of which someone's working seems to be more important alongside total volume. And this was an interesting study as well. So looking at a non-traditional strength rep range, and this was in resistance trained men as well. So this wasn't in complete beginners, but single set of 6 to 12 repetitions, 70 to 80% 1RM, 2 to 3 times a week, to volitional failure, so training to failure, whilst it produced slightly suboptimal increases in strength, it did actually increase 1RM. So again, like, intensity seems to be very, very important. So it may just be that the weight, basically the load and the rep sort of recommendations that we make for strength training are there to control how high the intensity of the effort is, which is kind of interesting and slightly counterintuitive to perhaps the more simplistic view of strength training, which is that you have to hit a particular rep range. And I think what I quite like about this paper is that a lot of my clients are looking for slightly suboptimal strength gains, because actually what they're looking for is also they want to move a bit better as well, and they want to feel a bit fitter. So I rarely train somebody who's looking for optimal, maximal strength training only. So I think I quite like this, because it means that I can, with a clear conscience, make sure that some of my clients are doing some very, very high intensity work, and sort of rest assured that when I say, oh, you will get a bit stronger, I'm not sort of making it up. So I think it was quite interesting. So it seems that with training frequency, volume trumps frequency when it comes to strength, within certain boundaries. So probably within 1 to 4 times of training per week. But changing the frequency of somebody's strength training program does allow you to manage recovery, because if you make them do it all in one session, they're not going to be able to walk the next day. So I think there's an advantage to that. Does that kind of make sense? I don't think that stuff is particularly...
You want to quickly tell the story about when you couldn't walk, Russ?
No, I don't want to tell that story, because it never happened. I don't know what you're talking about. Should I save that little gem for the end? Depends how much time everyone's got. All right, I will tell that story at the end. Thanks very much, Kerry, for bringing that one up, honestly. Because none of that information, I don't think that information is particularly sort of revolutionary in terms of changing anyone's, blowing anybody's mind with regards to strength training. I went into a little bit more detail about what the actual mechanisms are. And I might do a future presentation just on this slide alone, because I think there's a lot of detail. But without going through it in too much excruciating detail, some of the mechanisms that might lead to both of these programs being effective is that when we see higher loads, we get better neurological adaptations. And then if we maintain the training for a period of time, we also start to see physiological adaptations as well. So see an increase in motor unit recruitment, increase in rate coding, which is the strength and frequency of the signals that get sent from the brain to the muscle, increase in muscle cross-sectional area, so an increase in muscle size, increase in myonuclei density, and also we get fiber type transmutations, which is that the muscle fibers will mutate from type 2X fibers to type 2B, which are fast twitch glycolytic fibers. And they activate at a lower intensity, which means we produce more force when lifting submaximally, which is one of the reasons that we get stronger. The lower reps that we use in both of the programs are pretty optimal for fast twitch fiber development because there's lower oxidative stress, so it's unlikely we're using much type 1 activation. They have great anaerobic contractile capacity, which is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially they're just more effective at getting stronger, and they twitch quicker, so developing those fibers. The way it does that is by lowering one of the ways it does that is by lowering the fiber recruitment threshold, which means that a greater number of the motor units in that muscle are activated during the same lift, which gives us a certain economy of effort when we're trying to lift the same weight we lifted the week before. So the progressive overload that's planned into both of the strength programs then will be supported by the literature as a good way of going. And also, interestingly, Golgi tendon organ desensitization. So GTOs, as they're sometimes better known, they switch off muscles to protect joints and to protect us from injury when there's a high level of mechanical tension, which you obviously get with higher loads. And so obviously you want these guys to not kick in because they will essentially down-regulate the muscle force that you're able to produce. So they become less sensitive, so that helps increase the amount of force we produce. Does that make sense? There's quite a few mouthful words in there. But basically what it means is when you look at it like this, potentially the difference between the two programs, because they're both very good, but the difference between them is that 5x5 program doesn't really sneak over the 90 to 95% of 1RM sort of bracket. So it doesn't actually activate our type 2X, or arguably doesn't activate type 2X fibers as much as the 531, which obviously does dip into that maximal lifting zone. So it's less likely with the 5x5 that you'd get fiber transmutation, which is probably another reason why, as I said at the beginning, it's slightly better for beginners, because there are more neural adaptations for beginners to make before they get to the point where you start making structural changes to the fiber types. In terms of the rest periods that they put into the programs, again, no real surprises here, like 3 to 5 minutes rest seen as optimal. If you're lifting maximally, 1 to 2 minutes. Both of the programs prescribe 90 seconds to 3 minutes of rest. So both of them absolutely bang on with regards to rest periods in terms of lining up the literature. Another good paper here that looked at exactly that thing. They were just resting 1 minute rest intervals or 3 minutes, 8 weeks of training, 3 total body sessions per week, 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions using 7 different exercises. So a few more exercises than the programs we're looking at here. But their measure was 1 repetition max squat and bench press. And that increased to a greater extent for the participants who rested for 3 minutes as opposed to 1. And also muscle thickness was significantly greater as well. So there's a reasonable amount of evidence to suggest that slightly longer rest periods when you're looking at maximal strength are better than shorter rest periods. I think from a practical standpoint, filling that time with PT within PT sessions or looking at increasing session density, you're probably looking at using that rest time for mobility exercises or auxiliary exercises that might assist the main lifts. Sort of fired through that quite quickly. Are there any questions about that so far? No? Sweet.
Russ?
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Sorry, can I just ask a question? Where do you feel like the myth or kind of standard idea comes from about high weight, low reps builds more muscle than low weight, how did I say that?
Also, so lower load, higher reps is better for hypertrophy. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. As kind of common connotation, particularly for men versus women. Is there any kind of studies that debunk that or show that more? Or
so it's interesting the sense of it that I get when I've looked at that style of study is that basically the study design has evolved over time to iron out some issues in those early studies. So I think the early studies were almost biased towards, not engineering an answer, but I think they thought they had the answer already. And some of those early study designs maybe didn't do as good a job as they do now of eliminating some confounding variables. So I think that's certainly, one factor is that it's the studies have just developed. How do I let Monty in without stopping?
I don't know where he's gone.
I don't know where he's gone. Does he want to come back in? Anyway.
Yeah, he said.
2 seconds. He's not trying to get back in. So I think the study design has developed slightly. Some of the research, which I think it sounds like maybe you're aware of, is that they looked at heavier loads but a higher number of sets, so that you've got total, your volume is higher, but actually you're lifting a heavier weight, each repetition than you would typically lift for hypertrophy. And it's interesting that they've then obviously seen that you get, in some instances, like comparable results, in terms of muscle gain. So then it brought around the whole idea of maybe actually it's the total volume of work that counts more towards sort of gaining muscle. I think some of the programs that have come out of that have then developed and changed. So rather than being your 12 to 15 reps or 8 to 12 reps, that kind of stereotypical, you've now got a wider variation of rep ranges and set ranges within hypertrophy programs that now feel better supported by the literature. So that's, I think, what's happened in terms of the methodology. The mechanisms, Brad Schoenfeld has released a great paper, which I think at the moment is almost the position stand that most of that sort of field of research takes on hypertrophy, which is that you require varying levels of metabolic stress, muscle damage, and mechanical tension. And what he found was those are the three mechanisms of hypertrophy. So when you start looking at the booty building programs that use lots of bands and lots of high reps for building glutes, but don't necessarily talk about lifting heavy, they have a lot of metabolic stress and maybe some muscle damage, but not a massive amount of mechanical tension or load. So what you find is that it's not that they necessarily won't work at all, it's perhaps that they're just not optimal. Whereas those programs, these programs, if you were to step up the number of sets, they fall more towards the mechanical tension side of those three. So you get quite a bit of mechanical tension, not quite as much muscle damage, and not very much metabolic stress at all. So I think those two bits of information together, the changing in study design and then the discovery about, or the clarification around the mechanisms of hypertrophy, have probably changed the way that we look at programming.
Yeah, that's good to know. What was that gentleman's name you said about the
Brad Schoenfeld. Yeah, he's got a lot of research out. I'll put a link. I'll put a link in the network after this.
Thank you.
Yeah, he's released a few papers.
Yeah, and it's not better explain it to clients in a coherent way that they can understand as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think the way that I think is sensible to look at it is if somebody has used a particular training program in the past and is maybe not seeing results using that, but maybe they did initially, that's kind of classic. So if somebody's using high rep work, maybe HIIT training, and they've seen what they assume is muscle development. Maybe they've seen some muscle growth, but they're not used to using heavy loads. I'd be tempted to say, use one of those almost what looks like a strength program, but with a high number of sets, because the window of opportunity for adaptation will be far greater where they've done less training, whereas they will have made adaptations to make them more efficient at dealing with high rep work already. So to make even more adaptations by doing more of that is hard work practically, because it would mean very long sessions and, lots of training sessions per week. Whereas actually I tend to look for the biggest window of opportunity. Whereas if I get a guy in typically who's been like trying to lift as heavy as possible, get a band on him and make him do some glute kickbacks, and he's dying, he's just dying because the adaptations aren't there. So I think you can use it both ways. And that's obviously when you're programming as well, you can do a phase of that kind of training and then a phase of this training, knowing that they both will result in hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Let me dip back into this, and there might be some questions about this sort of stuff as well. This was an interesting one. Exercise selection of both these programs are pretty prescriptive for strength. And this paper looked at auto-regulated exercise selection. So they were taking people who were strength trained already, and then they were allowing them to have a say in what the exercises in their program were. And what they found was that they got relatively similar results for certain exercises within the program, but for, I think it was bench press, significantly improved bench press 1 rep max, which was the exercise that the participants had actually selected themselves. And they didn't see the same response with people who were not already well trained. And I think that works in practice. If you take somebody who's been training themselves for a while and you say you can only do these exercises, levels of motivation to attack that program is maybe not so high. If somebody has been training for a while, they already know which exercises they like, and you allow them to pick those exercises in their program, and you just prescribe the rep ranges and the intensities, someone's much more likely to attack those exercises with a bit more verve. So I think it's an interesting point when you're looking at strength training, depending on how much that person's already trained themselves, as to whether you give them something like a 5x5 and just say, this is what you're doing, or whether you actually say to them, we're going to use the same loading parameters, but you're going to get to select the exercises. For instance, like they might prefer front squats to back squats. But for a beginner, it didn't seem to happen so much. 5x5 uses linear periodization because it just steps up. There's no sense that you get harder exponentially and then you deload or anything like that. There are contingencies in there for if you hit a wall, but that's not the same as planning undulating periodization. Whereas the 5-3-1 gets more difficult for 3 weeks, then easier, and then steps up in a sort of step format. So this was a review paper, and what they found was that it's the higher workloads and the repetitions that produce the superior results, not necessarily which style of periodization they choose. So as coaches, I think from a practical standpoint, putting it back into what we do with our clients, both periodized programs used can both be recommended for untrained and moderately trained. They did it on women, both for linear periodization and undulating. So they both found to be effective. So it just means that we can select it based on what works for the client's preference, what we think might help motivation more. It also means that we can use one and then we can roll into a different periodization style without necessarily worrying that that's going to detract from the results that somebody might get. And my recommendation for strength training, if you're going to look at these two programs in isolation, would be that you do the 5x5 first, and then get someone really strong. When they hit that wall, go into the 5-3-1, where there's a bit more planned rest. I think this was a separate was this the same one, or oh no, same paper, but basically looking at the same idea, and they found that maximum strength, isometric power, muscular endurance were all, you know, all sort of basically the same across the two different styles of periodization. They did find that the maximum strength was slightly better in undulating periodization than more traditional linear, but that's not unanimous across all of the literature. So yeah, as I said, I think you can alternate from one to the other. You can use both, and you can also use it to talk to clients about which one they think they might prefer. And then the final bit I looked at, which was quite interesting, I didn't know there'd be a paper on this at all, but this paper looked at fitness apps and whether or not they would be deemed effective when you compare them or score them against the guidelines for exercise prescription put out there by the ACSM. And from sort of hundreds of thousands of apps, they selected 30 apps, but only 4 of those, of which the StrongLifts 5x5 app was one, only 4 of them were deemed to be scientifically backed, as it were. So what it means is that there are loads of apps out there which either just provide workout ideas and don't actually provide proper programming, or if they do provide proper programming, are just not deemed to be in line with what we understand to be effective and efficacious. So makes it difficult, I think, for clients to use apps when it comes to strength training without knowing which ones are effective or not. So yeah, that was my assessment of the two programs. That kind of makes sense.
That was really interesting, because I'm semi-familiar but not in as much detail with both of those, as well as the other points that you mentioned. So that was really interesting. Yeah.
So they're basically they both work. They both work, but the 5x5 is potentially slightly better for beginners.
I really want to get stuck into a good strength training program when I can train again.
You're just going to have to be on lower body, aren't you?
Yeah, I know. Well, that's like, I can't even